The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through Courtroom 7B, but it wasn't the sound of justice being served. It was the sound of mockery, of a system that had already made up its mind before the first witness even took the stand. Judge Harrison Blackwell adjusted his glasses with the kind of smug satisfaction that came from 30 years of looking down on people from behind a mahogany bench. He thought he'd seen everything that Tuesday morning in downtown Portland. He was wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maya Rodriguez had been dreading this moment for 3 months. The fluorescent lights in the Multnomah County Courthouse cast everything in a sickly yellow glow, making the marble floors look like they were covered in a thin layer of ice. She sat in the hard wooden chair outside Courtroom 7B, her palms sweating despite the November chill that seemed to seep through the old building's walls. Her attorney, David Chun, sat beside her reviewing his notes for the 100th time, occasionally, glancing at her with the kind of look that said he was preparing for the worst. "Remember what we talked about," Chen whispered, his voice barely audible above the murmur of conversations echoing through the hallway. "Keep your answers short and direct. Don't let him rattle you." Maya nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about her daughter Sophia, who was probably sitting in her second-grade classroom at Roosevelt Elementary right now, learning about addition and subtraction, blissfully unaware that her mother's entire future hung in the balance of what would happen in the next few hours. She was thinking about the apartment they shared on Hawthorne Boulevard, with its creaky floors and the window that stuck every time it rained, but it was home. It was theirs. The case should have been straightforward. 3 months ago, Maya had been working the late shift at Morrison's Electronics, a small repair shop in southeast Portland where she'd been employed for 2 years. She was good at her job, had never missed a day, never caused any trouble. She was the kind of employee who stayed late to finish repairs, who remembered regular customers' names, who treated every broken phone and laptop like it belonged to someone who depended on it. That night in August, everything changed. The owner, Gerald Morrison, had called her into his office just as she was about to clock out. Morrison was a man in his late 50s with thinning gray hair and a paunch that strained against his polo shirts. He'd always been friendly enough, but there was something different about him that night. His usual easy smile was replaced by something that made Maya's stomach clench with unease. "Maya, come in. Close the door behind you," he'd said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. The office smelled like stale coffee and the cheap cologne Morrison wore too much of. She'd sat down, expecting maybe a conversation about a difficult repair, or perhaps even good news about a raise. Instead, Morrison had leaned back in his chair and said, "You know, you're a very attractive woman, Maya. I've been thinking we should get to know each other better." The words hit her like a physical blow. Maya had dealt with unwanted attention before, but this was different. This was her boss, the man who controlled her paycheck, her ability to support her daughter. She'd tried to deflect, to laugh it off, to find a way out of the situation that wouldn't cost her the job she desperately needed. "Mr. Morrison, I think there's been a misunderstanding," she'd said, standing up from the chair. "I should probably get home. Sophia has school tomorrow." But Morrison had stood up too, moving around the desk with a confidence that told Maya this wasn't the first time he'd been in this situation. "Don't be shy, Maya. I've seen the way you look at me. And I think you know how much easier things could be for you here if we had a better understanding." What happened next was burned into Maya's memory with the kind of clarity that comes with trauma. Morrison had reached for her, his hand grabbing her wrist as she tried to back toward the door. For a moment, she'd frozen, the weight of her circumstances pressing down on her like a physical force. She was a single mother with no family in Portland, no safety net, no other job prospects lined up. Sophia needed health insurance, needed a stable home, needed her mother to keep it together. But then Morrison's grip had tightened, and something inside Maya had snapped. She'd pulled away, hard enough that Morrison stumbled backward against his desk, knocking over a coffee mug that shattered on the floor. "Don't touch me," she'd said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. "Don't ever touch me." Morrison's face had changed then, the fake charm dropping away like a mask. "You're making a big mistake, Maya, a very big mistake." She'd walked out that night and never went back. 2 days later, she'd received a letter informing her that she was being terminated for theft of company property. A week after that, the police had shown up at her apartment with a warrant for her arrest. According to Morrison's statement, Maya had stolen over $3,000 worth of electronics from the shop. According to the security footage he'd provided, she'd been seen taking items from the storage room and putting them in her bag. According to the inventory records, multiple high-end phones and tablets had gone missing during her shifts. Maya knew it was all fabricated, but Morrison had done his homework. The footage was real, but it showed her taking items to the front of the store for legitimate repairs, not stealing them. The inventory records had been altered, but skillfully, enough that it would take a forensic accountant to prove it. Morrison had turned her refusal into a weapon, and now she was facing 5 years in prison for felony theft. The public defender assigned to her case had been overwhelmed and overworked, more interested in pushing for a plea deal than fighting the charges. It was only when Maya's sister Carmen had scraped together enough money to hire David Chen that she'd felt like someone was actually listening to her story. Chen was young, maybe early 30s, with the kind of earnest determination that came from believing the system could still work if you pushed hard enough. He'd taken one look at Maya's case and seen all the holes in Morrison's story, but he'd also been honest about their chances. "The problem is credibility," he'd explained during their first meeting in his small office above a Thai restaurant in the Alberta district. "Morrison is an established businessman with no criminal record. You're a single mother who was fired for cause. The jury is going to want to believe him." "But I didn't steal anything," Maya had insisted, the same words she'd been saying for months. "I believe you," Chun had replied. "But belief isn't evidence, and evidence isn't always truth. We need to find a way to show the jury who Morrison really is." That had proven easier said than done. Morrison had been careful over the years, and while Chun had found 2 other former employees willing to testify that Morrison had made inappropriate comments, neither had experienced anything as direct as what Maya described. It would be her word against his, and the stolen merchandise gave Morrison's version of events a weight that would be hard to overcome. Sitting outside the courtroom, Maya could feel the weight of everything she stood to lose pressing down on her shoulders. If she was convicted, Sophia would go into foster care. Maya would lose the apartment, lose any chance of finding decent work again, lose everything she'd been fighting to build since she'd moved to Portland 5 years ago. Courtroom doors opened, and a bailiff called out, "Rodriguez versus the State of Oregon, Judge Blackwell presiding." Chun gathered his papers and stood up, offering Maya a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Remember, just tell the truth. That's all we can do." Maya stood on unsteady legs, smoothing down the conservative blue dress Carmen had bought for her at Goodwill. It was the kind of outfit she never would have chosen for herself, designed to make her look respectable, unthreatening, like the kind of person who couldn't possibly be a thief. She'd even covered the small tattoo on her wrist with makeup, not wanting to give the jury any reason to judge her before she even opened her mouth. Judge Harrison Blackwell was already behind the bench when they entered, his silver hair perfectly styled, his black robes pristine. At 62, Blackwell had developed a reputation as a law and order judge who believed in personal responsibility above all else. He'd grown up in the wealthy West Hills of Portland, attended private schools and Ivy League universities, and had spent his entire career looking down on people who, in his view, had made poor choices and needed to face the consequences. Maya took her seat at the defendant's table, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on her back. The gallery was mostly empty except for a few court watchers and Carmen, who had taken the morning off from her job at the hospital to be there. Maya didn't turn around to look at her sister, afraid that seeing Carmen's worried face would break what little composure she had left. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Walsh, was a woman in her 40s with the kind of confidence that came from winning more cases than she lost. She'd built her career on being tough on crime, and Maya's case was exactly the kind she excelled at, clear-cut, with obvious evidence and a defendant who fit the profile of someone likely to steal from her employer. Walsh's opening statement was a masterclass in persuasion. She painted Maya as a desperate single mother who had turned to theft when her expenses exceeded her income. She walked the jury through the evidence methodically: the security footage, the inventory records, Maya's termination, and her failure to report the alleged sexual harassment until after she'd been arrested. "Ladies and gentlemen," Walsh concluded, gesturing toward Maya with barely concealed disdain, "the defendant wants you to believe that her respected employer, a man who has run a successful business in this community for over 20 years, suddenly decided to frame her for theft because she rejected his advances. Ask yourselves, which is more likely? That a struggling single mother took some electronics to sell for quick cash, or that a successful businessman destroyed his reputation and committed multiple felonies just to get revenge on one employee?" When it was Chun's turn to present Maya's defense, he did his best to poke holes in Morrison's story, but Maya could see the skepticism in the jurors' faces. They looked at her and saw exactly what Walsh wanted them to see: someone who was probably guilty and definitely desperate. The first day of testimony was devastating. Morrison took the stand and delivered a performance worthy of an Oscar, playing the role of the betrayed employer with perfect pitch. He spoke about how much he'd trusted Maya, how shocked he'd been to discover the thefts, how disappointed he was that someone he'd tried to help had taken advantage of his kindness. When Chun cross-examined him about the alleged sexual harassment, Morrison's expression shifted to one of hurt confusion. "I have no idea why Ms. Rodriguez would make such accusations," he said, his voice heavy with sadness. "I can only assume she's trying to deflect attention from her own actions." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The security footage was played for the jury, and while Chun did his best to explain that it showed Maya doing her job, not stealing, the images were damning when viewed through the lens of suspicion. The inventory records presented by Morrison's accountant showed a clear pattern of missing merchandise that coincided with Maya's shifts. By the end of the first day, Maya felt like she was drowning. She could see it in the jurors' faces, in the way they looked at her, in the whispered conversations in the hallway. They'd already made up their minds. The second day was when Maya would finally get to tell her side of the story. She'd practiced her testimony with Chen dozens of times, going over every detail, preparing for every possible question Walsh might ask on cross-examination. But as she sat in the witness box, looking out at the courtroom, full of people who had already judged her, Maya felt her carefully rehearsed words crumbling in her throat. Judge Blackwell looked down at her with the kind of expression reserved for people he considered beneath his notice. When she began to speak about what Morrison had done to her that night in August, Blackwell's eyebrows rose in theatrical disbelief. "Ms. Rodriguez," he interrupted after Maya had described Morrison grabbing her wrist, "are you seriously asking this court to believe that Mr. Morrison, a pillar of this community, would risk everything to assault you in his own office?" The question hit Maya like a slap. She looked up at Blackwell, seeing the contempt in his eyes, and for a moment, she was back in Morrison's office, feeling powerless and small and utterly alone. "Yes, Your Honor," she managed to say. That's exactly what happened. Blackwell leaned back in his chair with a laugh that wasn't really a laugh at all. Ms. Rodriguez, I've been on this bench for 15 years, and I've heard every excuse, every sob story, every desperate attempt to avoid responsibility. Do you really expect anyone in this courtroom to believe this convenient tale of sexual harassment that only surfaced after you were caught stealing? Maya felt something break inside her chest. This was it then. This was how it would end. Not with justice, not with truth, but with a judge who had decided her fate before she'd even spoken. But then she looked out at the gallery and saw Carmen, her sister who had worked double shifts to pay for a lawyer, who had believed Maya's story when no one else would. She saw the court reporter, a woman about her own age, whose fingers had stopped moving over her keys as she listened to Blackwell's words. She saw the bailiff, whose expression had shifted from boredom to something that looked like disgust. Maya Rodriguez had spent 3 months being told she was worthless, that her word meant nothing, that her pain didn't matter. She'd been painted as a liar, a thief, a woman so desperate she'd destroy a good man's reputation to save herself. But sitting in that witness box, with Judge Blackwell's mocking laughter still echoing in the air, Maya realized something important. She was done being ashamed of who she was. Maya's hands trembled as she reached for the makeup compact in her purse. Judge Blackwell was still chuckling, shaking his head as if he'd just heard the most ridiculous joke of his career. The courtroom felt like it was closing in around her, the walls pressing closer with each passing second. Ms. Rodriguez, Blackwell continued, his voice dripping with condescension. Perhaps you'd like to tell us about your previous employment history? How many jobs have you held in the past 5 years? David Chun shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant's employment history is not relevant to the charges. Overruled, Blackwell replied without even looking at Chun. I think it's quite relevant to assess the defendant's character and credibility. Maya felt heat rising in her cheeks. She knew where this was going. Morrison's lawyer had done their homework, and they'd found every job she'd held since moving to Portland. The restaurant where she'd quit after the manager had cornered her. In the walk-in cooler. The cleaning service where she'd been let go after refusing to work alone with a client who'd made inappropriate comments. The retail job that had ended when she'd called in sick too many times because Sophia had caught pneumonia. I've had several jobs, Maya said quietly, her voice barely carrying across the courtroom. Several? Blackwell's eyebrows rose again. According to the information provided to this court, you've had 7 different jobs in 5 years. That's quite a pattern, wouldn't you say? The prosecutor, Rebecca Walsh, was practically glowing with satisfaction. This was exactly what she'd been hoping for, a chance to paint Maya as unstable, unreliable, the kind of person who couldn't hold down a job and therefore might resort to theft. Maya looked down at her hands, still clutching the makeup compact. The cover had come loose, and she could see her reflection in the small mirror, tired, defeated, exactly what everyone in this room expected her to be. But in that reflection, she could also see something else. The edge of the tattoo on her wrist, where the makeup had started to wear away from her nervous sweating. Ms. Rodriguez? Blackwell's voice cut through her thoughts. I asked you a question. Maya closed the compact with a sharp snap. Something had shifted inside her, like a dam finally giving way after holding back years of pressure. She looked up at Judge Blackwell, meeting his mocking gaze with steady eyes. Your Honor, I've had 7 jobs in 5 years because I keep running into men who think they can take whatever they want from women who need to work. Her voice was stronger now, carrying clearly to every corner of the courtroom. I left those jobs because I refused to trade my dignity for a paycheck. Blackwell's smile faltered slightly. Ms. Rodriguez, you're here to answer questions about theft, not to make speeches about your personal philosophy. But that's exactly why I'm here, isn't it? Maya stood up straighter in the witness chair. Because Gerald Morrison couldn't accept that I wouldn't let him steal something from me. So he decided to steal my reputation, my freedom, my future instead. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her hands frozen over the keys as she stared at Maya. In the gallery, Carmen had leaned forward, her eyes wide with a mixture of pride and terror. Walsh jumped to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is making inflammatory statements without any evidence to support them." But before Blackwell could respond, Maya was already rolling up her sleeve. The makeup that had covered her wrist tattoo was gone now, wiped away by sweat and nervous handling of the compact. What was revealed underneath made several people in the courtroom gasp audibly. The tattoo was small, maybe 2 inches across, but incredibly detailed. It showed a woman's face in profile, but half of the face was missing, replaced by a barcode. Below it, in delicate script, were the words, "Not for sale." Maya held up her wrist so everyone in the courtroom could see it clearly. "I got this tattoo 3 years ago, Your Honor, after the 4th job I had to leave because of sexual harassment. It reminds me every day that I am not merchandise. I am not something that can be bought, sold, or traded." Judge Blackwell's face had gone completely white. The smug confidence that had carried him through the morning was evaporating like steam. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, seemingly at a loss for words. Maya continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You want to know about my employment history? Let me tell you about it. I was 19 when I moved here from Tucson with my 2-year-old daughter. Her father had decided we weren't worth sticking around for, and my family thought I was a disgrace for having a baby so young. I came to Portland with $800 and a suitcase full of clothes that didn't fit the Oregon weather." She paused, looking around the courtroom. The jurors were hanging on every word now, their earlier skepticism replaced by something that looked like genuine attention. "My first job was at a diner on Powell Boulevard. The owner, Marcus Thompson, seemed nice enough when he hired me. Good tips, flexible schedule, perfect for a single mom trying to make it work. But Marcus had a problem keeping his hands to himself. It started with accidental brushes against my back when he walked behind me. Then it was comments about how I looked in my uniform. Then it was direct propositions, always when we were alone in the kitchen or the storage room." Maya's wrist tattoo caught the fluorescent lights as she gestured, the barcode seeming to pulse with meaning. "I reported it to the assistant manager, Jennifer Walsh. She told me that Marcus was just being friendly, that I was probably misinterpreting things. 2 weeks later, Marcus cornered me in the walk-in freezer after closing time. He told me that if I wanted to keep my job, if I wanted good shifts that would let me pay for daycare, I needed to show him how grateful I was." Judge Blackwell shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Something about Maya's voice, about the way she was telling her story, had changed the entire atmosphere in the courtroom. This wasn't the desperate woman making excuses that he'd expected. This was someone bearing witness. "I quit that night," Maya continued. "I walked out in the middle of my shift, left my apron on the kitchen counter, and never went back. Marcus called me the next day, furious that I'd left them short-staffed. He told me he'd make sure I never worked in food service in Portland again. And you know what? He kept that promise." Chun had stopped taking notes and was staring at his client with something approaching awe. This wasn't the testimony they'd rehearsed. Maya was going completely off script, but somehow it was working. Better than anything they'd planned. "My second job was at a cleaning service called Sparkle Clean. The owner, Robert Chun, hired me because I was willing to work nights and weekends. The pay was terrible, but it was honest work, and I could bring Sophia with me sometimes when I cleaned office buildings after hours." Maya's voice took on a bitter edge. "Robert had a special client, a lawyer named Frederick Walsh, no relation to the prosecutor here, I assume, who requested that I clean his home office every Thursday night. Frederick worked late, he said, and preferred to have the house cleaned while he was there to supervise. The first few weeks were fine. He was polite, professional, barely acknowledged I was there. She looked directly at Judge Blackwell, who seemed to be shrinking into his robes. But Frederick started staying later and later on Thursdays. Started offering me drinks, asking personal questions about my living situation, my relationship status. Started commenting on my appearance, telling me I was too pretty to be cleaning houses. I told Robert I didn't want to clean Frederick's house anymore, but Robert said Frederick was one of their biggest clients. If I couldn't handle one difficult customer, maybe I wasn't cut out for the job. The courtroom was so quiet that Maya could hear the heating system humming in the walls. Even Walsh seemed to have forgotten about objecting, too caught up in the story to interrupt. The night Frederick grabbed me, I was vacuuming his study. He came up behind me, put his hands on my shoulders, and told me he'd been thinking about me all week. When I tried to pull away, he grabbed my wrist, the same wrist Morrison grabbed, and told me he could make things very easy for me if I was smart about it. He said he had connections in the city, that he could help me get a better apartment, better childcare, maybe even help with immigration paperwork if I needed it. Maya held up her tattooed wrist again, and this time Judge Blackwell couldn't look away from it. I told him I wasn't for sale. That's when he got angry. He said I was being stupid, that women like me didn't get many opportunities, that I should be grateful someone like him was interested. When I still refused, he said he'd make sure Robert fired me and that he'd spread the word about my unprofessional behavior to other cleaning services in the city. What happened then? Chun asked quietly, though Maya suspected he already knew. I hit him with the vacuum cleaner attachment, Maya said matter-of-factly. Not hard enough to seriously hurt him, but hard enough to make him let go of my wrist. Then I gathered up my supplies and left. Robert fired me the next day, said Frederick had complained that I'd been drunk on the job and had damaged his property. Judge Blackwell cleared his throat, but his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Ms. Rodriguez, while this testimony is compelling ... I'm not sure how it relates to the charges against you. Maya turned to face him fully, and Blackwell actually leaned back in his chair as if her gaze had physical weight. It relates, Your Honor, because it establishes a pattern. Not a pattern of me being unable to hold down jobs, but a pattern of men in positions of power thinking they can take whatever they want from women who have no choice but to endure it. She stood up from the witness chair, and for a moment, it looked like the bailiff might intervene, but something in Maya's posture, confident but not threatening, determined but not aggressive, kept everyone frozen in place. My third job was at a retail store in the Lloyd Center. The manager, Kevin Martinez, was in his 20s, younger than me, but he acted like he owned the world. Kevin liked to schedule me for closing shifts, always alone with him. He'd find excuses to brush against me when we were doing inventory, to stand too close when he was training me on new procedures. He'd make comments about my body, about what he imagined I was like outside of work. Maya's voice was getting stronger, more confident with each word. The jury was completely absorbed now, several of them nodding as if they recognized the experiences she was describing. Kevin's favorite game was to call me into the back office for performance reviews that had nothing to do with my work. He'd close the door, sit on the edge of his desk, and ask me personal questions. Did I date much? Was I lonely? Did I ever think about older men, more mature men who could take care of me and Sophia? When I tried to redirect the conversation back to work, he'd get this look on his face like I'd personally insulted him. Judge Blackwell was no longer making any pretense of looking skeptical. His face had gone from white to gray, and his hands were gripping the edge of his bench so tightly that his knuckles were visible from across the room. The night Kevin tried to kiss me, I knew I was done. It was after closing. We were alone in the store, and he'd called me into the office to discuss my attitude problem. He said I seemed distant, unfriendly, that retail was about building relationships with management as well as customers. When I tried to leave, he blocked the door and told me he could make my job a lot easier if I'd just relax and let him take care of me. Maya paused, looking around the courtroom again. Carmen was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she listened to her sister's story. Several of the jurors looked angry, their earlier skepticism completely forgotten. That's when I got the tattoo, Maya continued, holding up her wrist again. After Kevin fired me for insubordination when I reported him to corporate, I realized something. This wasn't going to stop. There would always be another Marcus, another Frederick, another Kevin. Men who saw women like me, single mothers, immigrants, women without college degrees or family money, as easy targets. She looked directly at Morrison, who was sitting in the gallery behind the prosecutor's table. His face was flushed red, and he was staring at his hands as if he couldn't bear to meet her eyes. The tattoo artist was a woman named Rosa Gutierrez. She had her own shop in Southeast Portland, covered in ink from her neck to her fingertips. When I told her what I wanted, she nodded like she'd heard the story 1,000 times before. "Mia," she said, "you're not the first woman to walk through that door with this request. And you won't be the last." Maya sat back down in the witness chair, but her posture remained straight, confident. "Rosa told me that every woman has the right to decide what she's worth, what she accept, what she fight for. The barcode represents how society sees us, as products to be consumed, used up, discarded when we're no longer useful. The words remind me that I get to choose my own value." The courtroom reigned silent as Maya gathered her thoughts for what she knew would be the most important part of her testimony. Judge Blackwell looked like he was struggling to breathe. His earlier arrogance completely evaporated. "Your Honor, when Gerald Morrison grabbed my wrist that night in his office, when he told me I should be grateful for his attention, he made the same mistake that Marcus and Frederick and Kevin made. He saw the barcode but ignored the words underneath it. He thought I was for sale, and when he found out I wasn't, he decided to destroy me instead." Maya held up her tattooed wrist one final time, the courtroom lights catching the intricate details of the artwork. "This tattoo is my reminder that I am not merchandise. I am not something that can be bought with a paycheck, intimidated with threats, or silenced with false accusations. Gerald Morrison can lie about security footage, forge inventory records, and paint me as a desperate thief, but he cannot change the truth of what happened in his office that night." She looked directly at Judge Blackwell, who seemed to have aged years in the past few minutes. "And the truth, Your Honor, is that I am not for sale." The silence that followed Maya's declaration stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Judge Blackwell sat frozen behind his bench, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. The confident smirk that had defined his demeanor all morning was nowhere to be found. Replaced by something that looked suspiciously like Shane Dot, it was Rebecca Walsh who finally broke the spell, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Your Honor, while the defendant's story is certainly dramatic, we still haven't heard any actual evidence to support these allegations against Mr. Morrison." Maya turned to look at Walsh, and for the first time since taking the stand, she smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, or a friendly one. It was the smile of someone who had been holding back their best card and was finally ready to play it. "Actually, Ms. Walsh, there is evidence. There's quite a bit of evidence." David Chun straightened in his chair, his eyes widening. This definitely wasn't part of their rehearsed testimony. Maya had never mentioned having evidence beyond her own word. "Ms. Rodriguez," Judge Blackwell's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, "what evidence are you referring to?" Maya reached into her purse and pulled out a small digital recording device, the kind college students used to record lectures. She held it up so everyone in the courtroom could see it clearly. "I started carrying this after Kevin Martinez fired me from the retail job. Rosa Gutierrez, the tattoo artist, told me that if I was going to keep working, I needed to protect myself. She said predators rely on women being too ashamed to speak up, too afraid of not being believed. She was right. Walsh was on her feet again. Your Honor, if the defendant has had evidence this entire time, why wasn't it disclosed during discovery? This is highly irregular. But Maya was already speaking, her voice carrying easily across the now completely silent courtroom. I gave a copy of this recording to David Chun 3 days ago. He advised me not to reveal it unless absolutely necessary, because he was hoping we could win this case without having to expose Gerald Morrison for what he really is. Chun nodded, pulling a manila folder from his briefcase. Your Honor, the defense would like to submit audio evidence recorded by Ms. Rodriguez on the night of August 15th at Morrison's Electronics. Judge Blackwell's hands were shaking slightly as he gestured for the bailiff to retrieve the recording device. The transformation in his demeanor was remarkable. Gone was the arrogant jurist who had mocked Maya's testimony, replaced by a man who looked like he was dreading what he was about to hear. Before we play this recording, Maya said, standing up from the witness chair without being dismissed, I want everyone in this room to understand something. I didn't want to destroy Gerald Morrison. I just wanted to do my job, earn my paycheck, and go home to my daughter. But Morrison made a choice that night. He chose to see me as something he could take, and when I refused to be taken, he chose to destroy me instead. She looked directly at Morrison, who was sitting in the gallery behind Walsh's table. His face had gone completely pale, and sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the courtroom. Gerald Morrison thought he was safe because he owned the security cameras, controlled the inventory records, had the power to fire me and ruin my reputation. What he didn't know was that I'd been recording my conversations with supervisors for over a year, ever since Rosa told me that documentation was the only thing that would protect women like us. The bailiff had connected the recording device to the courtroom's sound system. Judge Blackwell looked at Maya with an expression that was part resignation, part curiosity, and part something that might have been respect. Ms. Rodriguez, you may proceed. Maya pressed play, and her own voice filled the courtroom, thin and tinny through the speakers, but unmistakably clear. Mr. Morrison, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I should probably get home. Sophia has school tomorrow. Morrison's voice came next, confident and predatory. Don't be shy, Maya. I've seen the way you look at me. And I think you know how much easier things could be for you here if we had a better understanding. The effect on the courtroom was immediate and electric. Several jurors sat forward in their seats, their faces registering shock and disgust. Walsh's confident posture crumbled, and she sank into her chair as if someone had let the air out of her. Morrison himself looked like he was going to be sick, but the recording wasn't finished. Maya's voice came through the speakers again, shaky but firm. I don't look at you any particular way, Mr. Morrison. You're my boss, and I respect that. But I'm not interested in anything beyond a professional relationship. Morrison's laugh was audible even through the static of the small recorder. Professional relationship? Maya, sweetheart, let's be honest about what this is. You're a single mother with no education, no skills, no family support. I'm offering you a chance to make your life better. All you have to do is be nice to me. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor came through the speakers, followed by Maya's voice, more urgent now. Mr. Morrison, please, I really need to go home. Where exactly do you think you're going to go? Morrison's voice had turned cold, calculating. You think there are a lot of job opportunities out there for women like you? Women with your ... background? I checked your references before I hired you, Maya. 7 jobs in 4 years. That's not exactly a stellar employment record. Judge Blackwell was gripping the edge of his bench so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. In the gallery, Carmen was crying openly, her hand pressed to her mouth as she listened to her sister being degraded and threatened. The recording continued, Morrison's voice becoming more aggressive. "I'm trying to help you here, Maya. I could fire you tomorrow and tell everyone in town that you were unreliable, unprofessional, maybe even dishonest. Or you could be smart about this situation and let me take care of you." "I don't need you to take care of me," Maya's recorded voice replied, stronger now. "I take care of myself and my daughter just fine. Do you?" Morrison's laugh was ugly, full of malice. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're barely keeping your head above water. How much is rent on that little apartment of yours? 800? 900? That's more than half your paycheck right there. And then there's daycare, groceries, utilities, car payments. Bet you're living paycheck to paycheck, aren't you?" The sound that came next was unmistakable, the thud of someone being grabbed, followed by Maya's sharp intake of breath. "Let go of me," her voice said, tight with fear and anger. "I'm not going to hurt you, Maya. I'm trying to help you. But you need to understand your position here. You need this job. You need me, and I need you to be a little more grateful." The sound of a struggle came through the speakers, followed by the crash of something hitting the floor. The coffee mug Maya had mentioned in her testimony. "Don't touch me." Maya's voice was stronger now, furious. "Don't ever touch me." Morrison's voice, when it came, was completely different, cold, controlled, dangerous. "You're making a big mistake, Maya, a very big mistake. You think you can just walk out of here? You think you can reject me and face no consequences? I own this business. I control your paycheck, your references, your future. And if you think you can just quit and find something better, you're even stupider than I thought." The recording captured Maya's footsteps as she moved toward the door, followed by Morrison's final threat. "You'll be back, Maya, when you can't make rent, when you can't feed your daughter, when reality sets in about what your options really are. You'll be back. And when you come crawling back, the price is going to be a lot higher." Maya pressed stop, and the courtroom fell into absolute silence. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her hands frozen over her keys as she stared. At the recording device, Judge Blackwell looked like he had aged a decade in the space of 10 minutes. His face was gray, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his water glass. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Mr. Morrison, please approach the bench." Morrison remained seated, his face a mask of panic and rage. "Your Honor, that recording could be fabricated. There's no way to authenticate ... Mr. Morrison," Blackwell's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "I said approach the bench, now." Morrison stood on unsteady legs, his expensive suit wrinkled from nervous sweating. As he walked toward the judge's bench, Maya noticed something she hadn't seen before. He was favoring his left leg slightly, the result of an old injury that she remembered him mentioning during her employment. It was a small detail, but it reminded her that underneath all his power and bluster, Gerald Morrison was just a man. A man who had made terrible choices and was now facing the consequences. Judge Blackwell leaned forward, his voice low but still audible throughout the courtroom. "Mr. Morrison, in 30 years on this bench, I have rarely heard evidence of such clear-cut criminal behavior. The recording we just heard contains explicit threats, sexual harassment, and what could be construed as attempted sexual assault." Morrison's lawyer, a thin man named Patrick Reynolds, who had been silent throughout the proceedings, finally found his voice. "Your Honor, my client maintains his innocence. The recording, even if authentic, doesn't prove that Mr. Morrison stole merchandise or attempted to frame Ms. Rodriguez." Maya stood up from the witness chair again, and this time no one tried to stop her. "Actually, Mr. Reynolds, it proves exactly that. Because the recording didn't stop when I left Morrison's office that night." She pressed play again, and Morrison's voice filled the courtroom once more, but this time he was clearly talking to someone else. "Tommy? Yeah, it's Gerald. Listen, I need you to do something for me, ... That woman Maya, The one who works the evening shift? She just quit, but I need to make sure she doesn't cause any problems for us. What do you mean, what kind of problems? She's the type who might file complaints, make accusations, try to damage the business. Yes, I know what I'm asking you to do. Just make sure the security footage from tonight shows her taking merchandise from the storage room. I don't care how you do it, just make it look convincing. The phones from the Samsung display, maybe some of the tablets. Make it look like she's been stealing for weeks. The courtroom erupted. Walsh was on her feet, objecting loudly, but her voice was drowned out by the gasps and murmurs from the gallery. Morrison had gone completely white, swaying on his feet, as if he might faint, but Maya wasn't finished. She let the recording play for another minute, capturing Morrison's detailed instructions to his accomplice about altering inventory records, creating false documentation, and timing the discovery of the theft to maximize damage to Maya's credibility. When the recording finally ended, Judge Blackwell sat in stunned silence for a long moment. Then, slowly, he turned to look at Morrison with an expression of such disgust that several people in the courtroom actually recoiled. "Mr. Morrison," Blackwell said, his voice now strong and clear, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit perjury, tampering with evidence, filing false police reports, and sexual harassment. Bailiff, please take Mr. Morrison into custody." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Morrison was shouting denials. His lawyer was demanding an immediate recess. Walsh was frantically shuffling through her papers, as if she could find some way to salvage her case. But through it all, Maya stood calmly beside the witness chair, her tattooed wrist visible to everyone in the room, a quiet symbol of strength in the midst of the storm. Judge Blackwell pounded his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. One. The noise finally died down. He looked directly at Maya with something that might have been admiration. "Ms. Rodriguez, on behalf of this court, I owe you an apology. My behavior this morning was inexcusable, and I allowed my own preconceptions to cloud my judgment. You showed remarkable courage in the face of what can only be described as a systematic attempt to destroy your life and reputation." Maya nodded graciously, but there was steel in her voice when she replied, "Thank you, Your Honor, but with respect, your apology isn't what matters here. What matters is that women like me, women without power, without connections, without expensive lawyers, are believed when we tell the truth about what happens to us." She looked around the courtroom, making eye contact with each of the jurors, then with the gallery, and finally with the court reporter who had been documenting every word. "Gerald Morrison thought he could destroy me because he saw me as powerless. He thought my word wouldn't matter against his, that my truth was worth less than his lies. He was wrong. Not because I had a recording device, but because the truth has its own power. It doesn't care about your bank account, your social status, or how many years you've been respected in the community. The truth just is." Judge Blackwell nodded slowly. "Miss Rodriguez, all charges against you are hereby dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Chun, please prepare a motion for sanctions against both Mr. Morrison and his attorney for prosecutorial misconduct." As the bailiff led Morrison away in handcuffs, he turned to look at Maya one last time. The confident predator who had cornered her in his office was gone, replaced by a broken man who had finally faced the consequences of his actions. Maya watched him go without satisfaction, without triumph, just a quiet sense of closure. She had proven that she was not for sale, not just to Gerald Morrison, but to a system that had tried to buy her silence with intimidation and shame. The tattoo on her wrist caught the light one more time as she gathered her things. The barcode, and the words below it, a permanent reminder that some things could never be bought, sold, or stolen. She was not for sale. And now finally, everyone knew it. 3 hours after Gerald Morrison was led away in handcuffs, Maya Rodriguez sat in David Chun's office above the Thai restaurant, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The adrenaline that had carried her through the morning was finally wearing off, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that felt like she'd been carrying weight for months and had only just set it down. Chun was on the phone with someone from the district attorney's office, his voice animated as he discussed the implications of Morrison's recorded confession. Through the thin walls, Maya could hear the lunch rush beginning downstairs, the sizzle of oil in woks and the cheerful chatter of customers who had no idea that a small piece of justice had been served just floors above their pad thai. Carmen sat beside Maya, holding her sister's hand like she used to when they were children, and Maya had nightmares. "I can't believe you've been carrying that recording around all this time," Carmen said softly. "Why didn't you tell me?" Maya flexed her tattooed wrist, watching the barcode catch the afternoon light streaming through Chun's dusty window. "Because I wasn't sure I'd ever be brave enough to use it. Rosa told me that evidence is only powerful if you're willing to let people hear it, and for a long time, I wasn't sure I was." The truth was more complicated than that, though Maya wasn't sure she could explain it even to herself. For months, she'd carried the recording like a talisman, knowing it could prove her innocence, but terrified of what would happen when people heard Morrison's voice, heard the way he'd spoken to her, heard the cold calculation with which he'd planned to destroy her life. There was something deeply personal about trauma, something that made you want to protect it, even when that protection was hurting you. Sharing the recording meant letting strangers into the worst moment of her life, letting them hear her fear and Morrison's cruelty, making herself vulnerable in a way that felt almost more intimate than what Morrison had tried to do to her in his office. Chun finished his call and turned to face them, his expression a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "Maya, the DA's office wants to file additional charges against Morrison. Conspiracy, witness intimidation, perjury, tampering with evidence. We're looking at potentially 15 to 20 years in prison." Maya nodded, but she felt strangely disconnected from the news. It was good, of course. Morrison deserved to face consequences for what he'd done, not just to her, but presumably to other women who hadn't been lucky enough to have a recording device in their purse. But justice felt more complicated than she'd expected it to. "What about Tommy?" she asked. "The person Morrison was talking to on the recording?" Chun's expression darkened. "Thomas Brennan, Morrison's nephew. He's been working part-time at the electronics store for about 2 years, mainly handling security and inventory. The police picked him up an hour ago. From what I understand, he's already admitted to altering the security footage and falsifying the inventory records. Will he go to prison too? Probably not. He's 19, no prior record, and it sounds like Morrison had a lot of influence over him. The DA thinks he'll plead guilty to lesser charges in exchange for testifying against Morrison." Maya found herself thinking about Thomas Brennan, a young man she'd barely interacted with during her time at Morrison's Electronics. He'd seemed quiet, polite, the kind of kid who said, "Yes, sir," and "No, ma'am," and kept his head down. She wondered what Morrison had told him to convince him to participate in the frame-up. What combination of family loyalty and manipulation had turned him into an accomplice? "There's something else," Chun continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "The police are reopening several other cases involving Morrison. Apparently, you're not the first employee to be fired under suspicious circumstances." This didn't surprise Maya as much as it probably should have. Men like Morrison didn't usually limit their predatory behavior to one victim. They found systems that worked, and they repeated them, growing bolder and more confident with each success. "How many others?" Carmen asked. "At least 3 that we know of so far. 2 other women who were fired for alleged theft, and 1 who quit after reporting sexual harassment. None of them had recordings, so the police couldn't pursue charges at the time, but with Morrison's confession on tape... Chun's words trailed off as the implications sank in. Maya's recording hadn't just saved herself, it had potentially given justice to women whose voices hadn't been heard. whose stories hadn't been believed. The thought should have been satisfying. But instead Maya felt a wave of guilt wash over her. If she'd come forward with the recording sooner, if she'd been braver, could she have prevented Morrison from hurting other people? "You're not responsible for what Morrison did to other women," Carmen said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "You were fighting for your own survival." Maya knew her sister was right, intellectually at least, but emotions weren't always rational. She thought about the 3 other women Chun had mentioned, wondered if they had children who needed them, wondered how many nights they'd lain awake, wondering if anyone would ever believe their stories. Chun's phone rang again, and he excused himself to take the call in the hallway. Through the thin door, Maya could hear him talking to what sounded like a reporter, his voice carefully professional as he declined to comment on the ongoing investigation. "This is going to be in the news, isn't it?" Maya asked Carmen. "Probably. A respected businessman arrested for sexual harassment and evidence tampering. That's exactly the kind of story the media loves." Maya felt her stomach clench. She'd spent months trying to keep her head down, trying to avoid attention, trying to protect Sophia from the scandal of her mother being accused of theft. Now there would be a different kind of attention, but attention nonetheless. "What am I going to tell Sophia?" she asked. Carmen squeezed her hand. "You're going to tell her the truth. That her mother is brave, that she stood up for herself and for other women, that she didn't let anyone make her into something she's not." Maya looked down at her wrist tattoo again, at the barcode that represented how the world saw her and the words that reminded her who she really was. When she'd gotten the tattoo 3 years ago, she'd thought of it as a defensive measure, a way to remind herself not to accept less than she was worth. She'd never imagined it would become a symbol of offense, a way to fight back against people who tried to reduce her to nothing more than her vulnerabilities. Chun returned from his phone call, his expression thoughtful. "Maya, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. The DA's office wants to know if you'd be willing to testify in Morrison's criminal trial." The question hit her like a physical blow. She'd just spent the morning reliving the worst experience of her life in front of a courtroom full of strangers. The thought of doing it again, with even more media attention, with Morrison's defense attorney trying to tear apart her credibility, felt overwhelming. "Do I have a choice?" "You always have a choice," Chin said gently. "The DA could potentially proceed without your testimony, using the recording and the evidence from Tommy Brennan's confession. But your testimony would make the case much stronger, and it might encourage other victims to come forward." Maya stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the busy street below. Portland was going about its afternoon business. People heading back to work after lunch, students walking to classes, mothers pushing strollers with the same determined efficiency Maya had once moved through the world with. Somewhere out there were the other women Morrison had victimized, probably wondering if they'd ever see justice, probably assuming that nothing would ever happen to the man who had hurt them. And somewhere else were women who were currently working for predators like Morrison, women who might be facing the same impossible choices Maya had faced in that office 3 months ago. "If I testify," Maya said without turning around, "will it help prevent this from happening to other women?" "It might," Chun replied honestly. "High-profile cases like this sometimes create precedents, make it easier for other victims to be believed, encourage prosecutors to take these cases more seriously." Maya thought about Rosa Gutierrez, the tattoo artist who had given her both the ink on her wrist and the advice to start recording her interactions with supervisors. Rosa had told her that every woman who stood up to harassment was fighting not just for herself but for all the women who would come after her. "There's something else you should know," Chun continued. "I got a call from an attorney in Seattle about an hour ago. Apparently, Morrison used to work up there, managed a chain of electronic stores before he moved to Portland and opened his own business. There are rumors about why he left Seattle, and this attorney thinks your case might encourage women up there to come forward too. The scope of Morrison's predatory behavior was beginning to come into focus, and Maya felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just about her anymore. Wasn't just about getting her own life back on track. This was about breaking a pattern that had probably been going on for years, maybe decades. Carmen joined her at the window, putting an arm around her sister's shoulders. Whatever you decide, I'll support you. But I want you to know how proud I am of what you did today. You didn't just save yourself. You probably saved women you'll never meet from going through what you went through. Maya leaned into her sister's embrace, drawing strength from the unconditional support she'd been lucky enough to have throughout this ordeal. Not every woman facing what she'd faced would have someone like Carmen in their corner, someone willing to work double shifts to pay for a lawyer, someone willing to take time off work to sit in a courtroom and bear witness to their pain. I need to think about Sophia, Maya said finally. If I testify in a criminal trial, there will be more media attention, more people talking about our family. She's only 7 years old. I don't want this to follow her for the rest of her life. Chun nodded understandingly. That's a valid concern. But I want you to consider something. Sophia is going to grow up in a world where she faced these same issues. By standing up now, by refusing to be silenced, you're helping to create a world where she might not have to make the same impossible choices you've had to make. Through the window, Maya watched a mother helping her young daughter navigate the busy sidewalk, the woman's hand protectively guiding the child around obstacles and dangers. That was all Maya had ever wanted, to be the kind of mother who could protect her daughter from the harsh realities of the world, who could create a safe space where Sophia could grow up without fear. But maybe protection didn't always mean shielding. Maybe sometimes protection meant fighting, meant standing up to bullies and predators and systems that tried to silence women who spoke truth to power. Maybe the best way to protect Sophia was to show her that her mother was not for sale, not now, not ever. Maya turned away from the window and faced Chin directly. If I testify, will you help me prepare? Will you make sure I'm ready for whatever Morrison's attorney tries to throw at me? Chun's face broke into a smile. Maya, after watching you handle Judge Blackwell this morning, I'm pretty sure you can handle anything Morrison's attorney dishes out. But yes, absolutely. We'll prepare you for every possible question, every possible attack on your character. Then I'll do it, Maya said, her voice steady and strong. I'll testify. Carmen squeezed her hand again, and Maya felt something shift inside her chest, like a door that had been locked for months finally swinging open. For the first time since that awful night in Morrison's office, she felt like herself again. Not a victim, not a defendant, not a woman fighting for survival, but simply Maya Rodriguez, a person with agency and power and the right to determine her own worth. The barcode tattoo on her wrist would always remind her of how the world sometimes saw her as a commodity to be used and discarded. But the words underneath would remind her of the truth she'd spoken in that courtroom. She was not for sale, and no one could ever make her be. Outside Chun's window, Portland continued its afternoon rhythm, unaware that a small piece of justice had been served, unaware that one woman's refusal to be bought had rippled outward into something larger than herself. But Maya was aware of it, could feel the weight of it settling into her bones like a promise. She was not for sale. And now the whole world knew it. 6 weeks after Gerald Morrison's arrest, Maya Rodriguez found herself in an unexpected place. The conference room of Portland's largest law firm, Hoffman & Associates, surrounded by mahogany furniture that probably cost more than she'd made in the past year. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now sitting in the kind of building where Frederick Walsh, the lawyer who had grabbed her wrist while she cleaned his office, probably conducted his business. Across the polished table sat 3 attorneys, 2 paralegals, and a woman who introduced herself as Detective Sarah Kim from the Portland Police. Bureau's Special Victims Unit. They were building what Kim described as a comprehensive case against Morrison, one that would encompass not just Maya's situation but a pattern of behavior stretching back over 15 years. Ms. Rodriguez, said the lead attorney, a woman named Patricia Hoffman whose gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun. We've now identified 7 additional victims willing to come forward. Your courage in refusing to accept a plea deal has opened doors that have been closed for far too long. Maya nodded, but her attention was focused on a stack of files sitting on the table between them. Each folder represented another woman whose life had been disrupted by Morrison's predatory behavior, another story of workplace harassment that had been buried under threats and intimidation. Detective Kim opened the first file. Jennifer Walsh, age 24 at the time, worked for Morrison at his previous job in Seattle. She reported sexual harassment to HR 3 times before being fired for performance issues. When she tried to file a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Morrison's company launched a countersuit claiming she had stolen proprietary information. The name Jennifer Walsh triggered a memory for Maya. Wait, Jennifer Walsh? I think she was the assistant manager at the diner where I worked. The one who told me Marcus Thompson was just being friendly. Detective Kim checked her notes. That's right. After her experience with Morrison, she moved to Portland and eventually became a restaurant manager. She reached out to us after seeing the news coverage of your case. She said she wanted to apologize for not believing you when you reported Thompson's harassment. Maya felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. Jennifer Walsh's refusal to take her complaint seriously had forced Maya to quit her first job in Portland. But now it seemed clear that Jennifer's response had been shaped by her own traumatic experience with workplace predators. The pattern is remarkably consistent, Patricia Hoffman continued, opening another file. Morrison would identify vulnerable employees, single mothers, immigrants, women with limited education or job prospects, and gradually escalate his behavior until he made explicit demands. When they refused, he would manufacture evidence of theft or poor performance to justify their termination. Detective Kim spread out a timeline across the table, with colored pins marking each incident. What's particularly disturbing is how Morrison refined his technique over time. The earliest victims in Seattle had no documentation, no recordings, no way to prove what had happened to them. By the time he got to Portland, he had developed a sophisticated system for discrediting women who refused his advances. Maya studied the timeline, seeing her own name at the end of a long line of women who had suffered at Morrison's hands. But there was something else that caught her attention. Several gaps in the timeline. Periods of months or even years where no incidents were reported. What happened during these gaps? Maya asked, pointing to the empty spaces. Patricia Hoffman's expression darkened. We think those represent women who accepted Morrison's demands rather than fight them. Women who were too afraid of losing their jobs, too worried about their families, too isolated to resist. The weight of that statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Maya thought about the conversation she'd had with Rosa Gutierrez, the tattoo artist who had told her that every woman who stood up to harassment was fighting for all the women who would come after her. But Rosa had also acknowledged that not every woman was in a position to fight, that survival sometimes required terrible compromises. There's something else, Detective Kim said, pulling out a different file. We've been in contact with law enforcement in 3 other cities where Morrison worked before Seattle. The pattern goes back even further than we initially thought, at least 20 years of this behavior. Maya felt her stomach clench. 20 years meant dozens of women, maybe hundreds, who had encountered Morrison's predatory behavior. How many had been fired? How many had been forced to accept his advances to keep their jobs? How many had been too traumatized or too afraid to ever speak up? Why was he never caught before? Maya asked. Several reasons, Patricia Hoffman replied. First, Morrison was smart about choosing his targets. He went after women who were unlikely to be believed, who had the most to lose if they fought back. Second, he was careful to space out his behavior. Never too many incidents in one location. Never in a way that would create obvious patterns for investigators. Detective Kim nodded in agreement. But most importantly, the systems weren't in place to catch someone like Morrison. Police departments didn't talk to each other about workplace harassment cases. Employment attorneys weren't sharing information about patterns of abuse. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was understaffed and overwhelmed. Morrison fell through the cracks because the cracks were enormous. Maya thought about her own experience trying to find justice after quitting Morrison's Electronics. If she hadn't had that recording, if David Chun hadn't been willing to take her case, if Judge Blackwell hadn't been forced to confront his own prejudices, Morrison would have gotten away with it again. The system hadn't protected her. She had protected herself, almost by accident. What's different now? Maya asked. What's going to prevent the next Gerald Morrison from doing the same thing? Patricia Hoffman leaned forward, her expression intense. You, Miss Rodriguez, your case has created what we call a precedent effect. Every prosecutor in the Pacific Northwest now knows that workplace sexual harassment cases can be won, that juries will believe women when they're presented with credible evidence, that judges can be held accountable for their biases. Detective Kim added, we're also seeing changes in how police departments handle these cases. Your recording has been used in training sessions across the country as an example of why documentation is crucial, why victims should be encouraged to preserve evidence even when they're not ready to come forward immediately. Maya reached unconsciously for her wrist, touching the tattoo that had become a symbol of her refusal to be bought or sold. She thought about all the women who were probably sitting in their cars outside offices right now, trying to work up the courage to walk inside and face another day of harassment, another impossible choice between their dignity and their survival. There's one more thing, Patricia Hoffman said, pulling out a final file. We'd like your permission to use your story as the foundation for a class action lawsuit against Morrison's business and his previous employers. The women who are coming forward deserve compensation for what they've endured, but more importantly, the companies that enabled Morrison's behavior need to be held accountable. Maya considered the request. A class action lawsuit would mean more media attention, more public scrutiny, more time spent reliving the worst experiences of her life. But it would also mean that Morrison's victims would receive some measure of justice, some acknowledgement that what had happened to them mattered. Will it help prevent this from happening to other women? Maya asked. It will send a message to employers that turning a blind eye to sexual harassment is expensive, Detective Kim replied. When companies start facing million-dollar lawsuits for enabling predators, they tend to take prevention more seriously. Maya thought about Sophia, who was now 8 years old and becoming more aware of the world around her. Just the week before, Sophia had come home from school, asking why some of the older girls talked about being afraid to walk alone at night, why her teacher had spent time during health class talking about inappropriate touching, why Maya sometimes got quiet when certain stories came on the news. I want Sophia to grow up in a world where she doesn't have to choose between her safety and her survival, Maya said finally. If this lawsuit helps create that world, then yes, you have my permission. Patricia Hoffman smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Maya had seen from her. Ms. Rodriguez, I've been practicing employment law for 25 years, and I've never seen a case have the kind of impact yours has had. You've changed how we talk about workplace harassment, how we investigate these cases, how we support victims. As Maya left the law firm that afternoon, she found herself thinking about the 7 women who had found the courage to come forward after hearing her story. She thought about Jennifer Walsh, who had carried her own trauma for so many years that she'd been unable to recognize it in someone else. She thought about the women whose names weren't in any files, who had made different choices, who had survived in whatever way they could. The barcode tattoo on her wrist caught the late afternoon sunlight as she walked to her car, a reminder of how the world had once seen her and how she had refused to accept that valuation. But the words underneath, "Not for sale," had become something more than a personal reminder. They had become a battle cry, a statement of principle that was echoing through courtrooms and conference rooms across the country. Maya Rodriguez had stood up in a courtroom and declared that she was not for sale. In doing so, she had given other women permission to make the same declaration, to refuse the same impossible choices, to demand the same basic dignity. The revolution, it turned out, had started with a tattoo and a recording device. But it was spreading, one woman at a time, one story at a time, one refusal at a time. And Gerald Morrison? He was still sitting in a jail cell, waiting for his trial, probably wondering how a single mother with a tattoo on her wrist had managed to bring down his carefully constructed empire of exploitation. The answer was simple. She had refused to be what he thought she was. And in refusing, she had shown other women that they could refuse too. 1 year later, Maya Rodriguez stood in front of Roosevelt Elementary School, watching her daughter Sophia walk confidently toward the building, where she was now in 3rd grade. The Oregon autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of falling leaves and the promise of rain that would soon turn Portland's landscape into the lush green that made the city famous. Sophia turned back once to wave, her backpack bouncing as she joined a group of friends heading toward the main entrance. Maya waved back, marveling at how normal this moment felt, how beautifully ordinary it was to stand here, worrying about nothing more complicated than whether Sophia had remembered her. Lunch money. Her phone buzzed with a text from David Chun. "Verdict in 30 minutes. You ready?" Maya typed back, "Ready as I'll ever be." Gerald Morrison's criminal trial had lasted 3 weeks, with Maya testifying for 2 full days about everything from that night in his office to the systematic way he had tried to destroy her life afterward. Morrison's defense attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Richard Blake, had tried every tactic in the book to discredit her testimony, questioning her motives for recording the conversation, suggesting she had somehow manipulated the audio, implying that her history of job changes indicated dishonesty or instability. But the recording spoke for itself. And so did the 7 other women who took the stand to describe their own experiences with Morrison. And so did Thomas Brennan, Morrison's nephew, who had pled guilty to evidence tampering in exchange for his cooperation and had testified in painful detail about how his uncle had convinced him to alter security footage and falsify inventory records. Maya drove to the courthouse through streets that felt familiar now, past the coffee shop where she'd met with Chun dozens of times to prepare for trial, past the law offices where she'd given depositions for the class action lawsuit that was still working its way through the courts. Portland had become a different city for her over the past year, not because the place had changed, but because her relationship to power had fundamentally shifted. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and cameramen, a sight that would have terrified Maya a year ago, but now felt like just another part of the process. She spotted Detective Sarah Kim near the main entrance, talking to a woman Maya didn't recognize, probably another journalist working on one of the follow-up stories that had emerged from Morrison's case. Inside, the same courtroom where Judge Harrison Blackwell had mocked her testimony was packed with observers. Maya noticed several faces she recognized. Jennifer Walsh, the former diner manager who had apologized for not believing Maya's harassment complaint years earlier. Rosa Gutierrez, the tattoo artist who had driven up from her shop to witness the verdict. Carmen, of course, sitting in the front row where she'd been for every day of the trial. But the most surprising presence was Judge Blackwell himself, sitting quietly in the back of the gallery. He caught Maya's eye as she entered and nodded respectfully. 6 months after Morrison's arrest, Blackwell had voluntarily enrolled in sensitivity training for judges, becoming an unexpected advocate for reform in how the courts handled sexual harassment cases. Morrison sat at the defendant's table looking smaller than Maya remembered, his expensive suits replaced by a standard jail uniform, his confident swagger diminished by months of incarceration and the weight of overwhelming evidence against him. He didn't look at Maya as she took her seat, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched on the table in front of him. At exactly 2:30 p.m., the bailiff called the court to order, and the jury filed in. Maya had learned to read jury faces during the trial, and what she saw in their expressions now made her heart race with cautious optimism. They looked serious, determined, like people who had wrestled with difficult decisions and reached a conclusion. They were confident in the foreman, a middle-aged woman who worked as a high school principal, stood to deliver the verdict. Maya found herself touching the tattoo on her wrist, the gesture that had become her unconscious habit whenever she needed to remember who she was and what she was worth. On the charge of sexual harassment in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, but Maya felt strangely calm. This was the outcome she had hoped for, but it felt less like victory than like completion, the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. On the charge of conspiracy to commit perjury, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of tampering with evidence, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of filing false police reports, we find the defendant guilty. When the foreman finished reading all 7 guilty verdicts, the courtroom erupted in scattered applause before the judge gavelled for order. Maya looked over at Morrison, who had slumped forward in his chair as if the weight of the verdicts had physically pushed him down. Judge Patricia Chun, no relation to Maya's attorney, announced that sentencing would take place in 2 weeks. But given the severity and number of convictions, Morrison was looking at 15 to 20 years in prison. For a man in his late 50s, it was effectively a life sentence. As court adjourned and people began filing out, Maya felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Rosa Gutierrez, the tattoo artist whose advice had started Maya on the path to documenting her experiences with workplace predators. "How does it feel, Mia?" Rosa asked, her own arms covered in intricate ink that told stories Maya was only beginning to understand. Maya considered the question seriously. "It feels like the beginning of something, not the end." Rosa smiled knowingly. "That's because it is. You started something that's going to outlive all of us." Over the past year, Maya had received hundreds of emails and letters from women across the country who had heard her story and found the courage to come forward about their own experiences with workplace harassment. Some had recordings of their own. Others had witnesses, documentation, or evidence they had never thought would be believed. All of them referenced Maya's tattoo, her refusal to be sold, her insistence that her truth was worth fighting for. 3 major corporations had already settled harassment lawsuits where plaintiffs explicitly cited Maya's case as precedent. 2. States had passed legislation requiring mandatory reporting of workplace harassment complaints. And the phrase "not for sale" had become a rallying cry for women's rights advocates across social media. Detective Kim approached as Maya was leaving the courthouse, a folder tucked under her arm. "Maya, I wanted you to know, we've opened investigations in 4 more cities based on tips that came in after Morrison's conviction. It looks like his pattern of behavior was even more extensive than we realized." Maya nodded, not surprised, but still saddened by the scope of Morrison's predatory behavior. "How many more women?" "We're not sure yet, but potentially dozens. The good news is that several of them kept documentation, inspired by your example. They're going to be much easier cases to prosecute." As Maya walked to her car, she thought about all the women who had made different choices than she had, who had accepted Morrison's demands or simply endured his harassment in silence. She felt no judgment toward them. She understood better. than anyone how impossible those choices could be, how survival sometimes required terrible compromises. But she also thought about Sophia, who would grow up in a world where Maya's refusal to be bought and sold had created new possibilities for resistance, new expectations for justice, new belief that women's voices mattered. Her phone rang as she reached her car. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize with a Seattle area code. "Ms. Rodriguez, my name is Angela Martinez. I work for a law firm in Seattle, and we're representing a group of women who were harassed by their supervisor at a tech company here. We were wondering if you might be willing to speak at a conference we're organizing about workplace harassment documentation and advocacy." Maya looked back at the courthouse where reporters were still interviewing legal experts about the significance of Morrison's conviction. A year ago, she had been a single mother cleaning offices and repairing electronics, invisible to the powerful people who controlled her economic fate. Now she was being asked to share her expertise with lawyers and advocates who were fighting similar battles across the country. "I'd be honored to speak," Maya told Angela Martinez. "When and where?" As she drove home through the Portland streets she had come to love, Maya thought about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. It had started with a tattoo that reminded her she was not for sale. It had continued with a recording device that captured a predator's true nature. But it had become something much larger than either of those things. That had become proof that individual courage could create collective change, that one woman's refusal to accept unacceptable treatment could ripple outward in ways she never could have imagined. Maya Rodriguez had stood up in a courtroom and declared that she was not for sale. In doing so, she had given other women permission to make the same declaration, to refuse the same impossible choices, to demand the same basic dignity. Gerald Morrison was going to prison, but his conviction was just the beginning of the story. Maya had started telling every woman who found the courage to document harassment, every prosecutor who took these cases seriously, every judge who listened with respect instead of skepticism. They were all part of a larger narrative about power, dignity, and the price of justice. The barcode tattoo on Maya's wrist would always remind her of how the world once saw her. But the words underneath had become something more powerful than she had ever imagined. Not just a personal reminder, but a revolutionary statement that was changing how society valued women's truth. She was not for sale. And now, finally, everyone believed it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.